Low ego action heroes. This is Debbie Levitt from Delta CX. We're a full service CX and UX agency, and welcome for the second time today to Office Hours Ask Me Anything. And today we do have a special guest who will be joining me momentarily. I see him off to the side. Yeah, you don't. But you will soon. So everybody get ready with your questions. As usual, you can ask your questions through the chat rooms. I'm monitoring LinkedIn and YouTube, and you can also ask at deltacx.link/ask. It is so small, I should make that bigger. But basically that will send me a question through our anonymous system if you want to bitch about work or people and you don't want us to know who you are. So we've got all the different ways to ask questions, both anonymously and non-anonymously. The other thing that I just want to remind everybody is that we will go a little bit late today to make sure questions are answered, but then I've got a hard stop in about 75 minutes. So if you care, get those questions in early. And if you care, won't you please subscribe on YouTube, because that's like a 14-second delay. It's nearly a conversation. Over on LinkedIn, y'all are delayed like 2 minutes. You are just hearing me say, welcome, low ego action heroes. So please join us over on YouTube on the Delta CX channel. And of course, also test driving the new technology of the tip jar. So if anything comes in, I thank you for supporting the channel, since I don't turn on ads on YouTube, and it all goes to delicious Italian cheese. Now, let's bring in our guest. Finally, the one and only author of Interviewing Users: How to Uncover Compelling Insights, and Doorbells, Danger, and Dead Batteries: User Research War Stories. Please welcome Steve Portigal.
Hello, live studio audience. That's a lovely round of applause.
Please spell your name and tell everybody who you are.
So my first name is Steve, S-T-E-V-E, and my last name is Portigal, Portigal. And if you have those two words, you can probably find me everywhere on the internet. I am coming to you today from Montera, California, which is a little teeny coastal town near Silicon Valley and near San Francisco. I run my own consulting practice, and my specialty is user research. 2021, which is, I guess, where we are now today when we're all talking, is 20 years since I started this business, which is crazy. So I've been doing this for a long time, and so I'll have lots of stories about. I remember when I grew up in Canada, near Toronto, and lived here in the Bay Area for a long time. I have 2 dogs, not 5 dogs like some people, but I've learned to have 5 dogs. I have 2 dogs, one of whom is here with me now, well below camera range. Anyway, my work in user research, writing about it, teaching it, obviously doing research for many, many years, is, I think, what a lot of people know me for, and I think sort of the expertise. And Debbie, you mentioned a couple of books that I've written. I also have a podcast called Dollars to Donuts. It's a podcast where I talk to people who are running user research practices in organizations. And so here's my first old person story. There were not always in-house user research teams, let alone in-house user researchers or leaders. If you go back to kind of the era that I started out in anyway, there were only like small agencies doing this kind of work. So it's relatively new that people are building practices inside companies, and we have people with many years experience now that are involved in leadership, and that's the area of focus for the podcast and why I created the podcast. Because relatively speaking, this is new. Let's kind of go look at it and talk to people. So I'm looking forward to questions and hearing what we want to talk about today. Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you so much. And everybody, get your questions in. Come on, this is Office Hours, Ask Us Anything, and that's what you got to do. I am doing my best to monitor all the things. I've got the YouTube comments ready for action. We have the ghost of Darren Hood here who says, boo. And Kelene, I'm going to put your question after your other question. So just know that I'm adding it to the list. I keep a list of questions, and they all end up as the YouTube description so that you can glance later and see what the heck we talked about. Darren says, I didn't know about the podcast. Thanks for sharing that, Steve. Yep, everybody follow everybody. So the first question that I got, and I got a few days ago, so I've been holding it closely, and it says, hey Debbie, I saw episode 70, which was an earlier podcast and interview I did on DevOps, but I wondered your take on design ops, and who better to answer that than Steve?
I did not expect that to get thrown to me.
What? I just told you I was throwing you every question first.
All right. You did tell me that. But then you came up with a question that... so I'm gonna answer an adjacent question and then send it back to you to kind of fill in the gaps of the thing that was actually asked. If you don't know about research ops, it's the newest ops. I feel like I'm selling a flavor of something. Research ops is a really interesting sort of emergent area of ops around, designing user experiences. I think DevOps led to design ops. I had this conversation with somebody yesterday, and we were like, exploring what we thought the definitions of each of these were. And I've always, just not being a practicing designer or a trained designer or any kind of designer, I've always been a little stymied by design ops specifically. But I think research ops is interesting, and I'm sure we'll get into some of these other issues that it touches. It's interesting because it's probably one of the biggest changes I have seen in the practice of user research, especially, again, as things have moved to these larger in-house teams, is creating some infrastructure to let research happen in efficient ways, in effective ways, both for researchers, and then if you know Kate Towsey, who heads research ops at Atlassian, is writing a book about research ops. She talks about researchers and people who do research, and she calls that PWDR. So that the research ops is all the infrastructure to kind of empower all those people to work on their own. So it's solving a different problem, I think, than design ops is in terms of who we're trying to empower and what infrastructure. So that's my adjacent answer, Debbie. I can't speak in an intelligent way to design ops, so I'm going to lob that back to you.
Why, thank you. Yeah, totally. This is a tag team adventure, no wrestling. Basically, what I've been saying for a few years now is I'm not totally into the whole ops name. I'm the person who said, wasn't this the same strategy that we were already doing? I mean, we already had strategy and operations in many cases. Obviously, as Steve pointed out, not every organization is built up with that, but usually there's, even if you're the UX team of one, you are doing some sort of strategy and you're stuck with the operations. And so I guess my gut reaction to it was it seemed like the kind of thing that didn't need a fresh name and that we should have just called it strategy. So I'm just one of those people. I'm not against the actual thing, but I'm like, oh no, another name and thing we're going to try to say is new. Boo. That's how I felt about it. So, and then the person who asked it sent me I like the shrug emoji floating by from Kelene. The person who sent the question sent me a Nielsen Norman group on design operations 101. And what it means, and my thought is, I'm not even going to look at that because, again, if you can have good leadership at your company who's going to be strategic, why not call it CX and UX strategy? I don't know. Maybe I'm just a negative Nelly. We have a question from Kelene that came in with sound. I'm going to do my best to share it with everybody. Let me see if I can do this. Hold on. This is an experiment in experimenting. Let's try it. Tell me if you can hear this.
Hey Steve, this is Kelene, a mentee of Debbie's. Thanks for joining us today. As a newbie researcher doing an interview, my brain initially phrases exploding questions in a biased way. How can I quickly translate my exploding questions into a phrasing that's more neutral while listening on the fly and not ruining the interview flow? Thank you.
All right, that worked.
Awesome.
Steve, for you.
Yeah, my brain initially freezes exploding questions in a biased way. How can I translate my exploding questions to a phrasing that's more neutral while listening on the fly and not ruining the interview flow? So this is a great question, and it's kind of a complicated question. Like, just to look at this, translate exploding questions into.
She said I wrote it out wrong. She said it phrases exploding questions in a biased way, not freezes.
Yeah.
Okay. My brain initially phrases exploding questions in a biased way. I got to fix phrasing. Sorry. Steve, back to you.
That's good. I like the density of the question because I think it reveals just the truth of this. Translate exploding questions into a phrasing that's neutral while listening on the fly and not ruining the interview flow. So that's just the question is very layered, and it really captures. So yes, this is terrible prose, but this is perfect. There's a perfect question because the density of the question sort of captures what's going on in our brains when we are in these situations. When we're doing an interview, we're thinking about what to ask next. We're like watching the clock. We're thinking about what they just said and what it means. We're generating, exploding questions. Yeah, all the different things that come up that you want to ask. So that is, you've really captured very well the complexity and kind of the challenge here. And as this is my answer to these things is often, by identifying it as specifically as you have, it's that thing about giving something a name. You've articulated the repeating sort of forces and demands on your brain in this intense situation where you're trying to be natural and authentic with somebody else. So just sort of saying, like, yeah, this is a lot. There's a lot of things happening here all at once. So, I mean, if I say something like, just try to slow down, I think like that can easily be sort of a dismissive, unhelpful advice. But I'm still gonna try that. Like, try and slow down. And I think, by slowing down, think about just the next thing that has to happen. You're sort of looking for your autopilot because I think, what you're describing here, right? We talk about staying present, staying in the moment. You really control like the next thing that you're going to do. And so while that person is talking, you are balancing all these factors like you've described it so well. What's the next thing to ask? How should I say it? Is it the right thing? Am I getting to all the insight? Like, that's a lot. So when I say slow down, I mean, acknowledge that all of this is going on, which you've done a good job. And, forgive yourself, just accept yourself. Like, this is true for a newbie researcher, but this is true for a researcher of any amount of experience. This sort of like panic and potential panic, I think we're all subject to it. So you may not feel like you're handling it well, but I think I feel like the question is such an encouraging sign. So what's the next thing that you're going to do? And just try to focus on that, shut the other things out. So that, I think, is a way to slow down, like acknowledge all these competing pressures, wait for the moment that you are going to ask your next question and ask a question, or just say, or, oh. And that's like, just keep going kind of step by step by step in these incremental kind of moments of being present. And the other stuff will follow. But yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm excited to see you proceed along these lines. Very good.
I'm excited about Kelene too. Thank you for that answer. And she actually had another question as well that I'm going to put up in the usual manner. And it says, Steve, do you find in your experience that the hyperspeed flow thing is always a good thing?
And I think that's a reference to things that I have written or talked about in this moment. This challenge that Kelene is describing so well is that sometimes what feels overwhelming and kind of complex and dense with all these pressures, that sometimes there's a flow state that emerges from it. And by flow state, I don't know if I'm describing it exactly right, but flow state is almost like instead of you sort of forcing to slow down, it's almost like the world just slows down and this suddenly everything is kind of relaxed and there's all this extra space kind of in between you and the person and the question. I think that's what the question is about. And it feels like, yeah, the hyperspeed is sort of like you're going fast and you're slowing down. It's a really interesting moment. It doesn't happen for me very often. It may not happen for you ever. Is it a good thing? Yeah, I think flow state is sort of a joyous state to be in where you're working really, really hard. And instead of struggling, it's sort of providing its own reward. So yeah, I think I work very hard in interviews to figure out what to talk about and figure out where to get to. Yeah, and here's a follow-up question. Does it produce good research results?
Oh,
yes.
Else came up on the screen. Sorry.
Yeah, you're not doing that? I think it's a clarification to where the conversation is. So yes, I think good research results come from you being able to be more intentional about directing the conversation and paying attention. So I wouldn't want anyone to feel bad if they don't enter a flow state in some amount of work that we're doing. Like it's a pretty elusive thing to reach for. But I think, yes, I think you are getting good results if you are finding yourself sort of relaxed and calm as opposed to sort of manic and pressured.
Can't disagree there. I missed what just came up on the screen, but somebody did something and it's in the tip jar, and thank you very much. I missed what it was, so thank you to whoever did a thing, and I'll have to look up later what that was, but thank you for donating to the Cheese Fund. Kelene says, someone joined our first tier membership. Thank you for becoming a member on YouTube. Thank you so much. You have unlocked the dog emoji and the Don Norman emoji, and the Debbie going like this emoji. So enjoy those. We've got a question from Wilson. Wilson says, hi, Debbie and Steve. Got any tips on recruiting for participants that are in a niche market? I'm currently trying to recruit smaller YouTubers looking for others to collaborate with. I've tried Reddit and Discord communities and it's been hard.
I think the question about recruiting is an interesting one, I think, because people want, understandably, sort of best practices, but there's something so localized about recruiting. So I think, it's a great question and we should only share tips and brainstorm ideas, but there will come a point where, you're the expert in recruiting in your space. But I'll offer one sort of pragmatic suggestion, and this is the idea of snowball recruiting. And recruiting is just simply if you have someone, you ask them to refer you to somebody else. So the idea of a snowball that gets bigger that's very exciting when that happens. Sorry, when the tip jar gets a new little jewel in it. Anyway, a snowball rolls downhill and it gets bigger and bigger as it goes. So snowball recruiting is you ask someone to make referrals, and then they make referrals, and you ask those people to make referrals and introductions and so on. So I think it's a great way to get inside a community that you can't sort of otherwise get to. You're in sort of pure snowball recruiting, a recruit refers you to another participant. But also I think, a community member a thought leader or an influencer may not actually be a recruit for you, but they still can make introductions. So, doing all the social networking things. And I don't mean using online social networks. I mean the human activity of social networking, of, being very clear and crisp about what it is that you want. And I don't know what you're doing specifically, but I'll say that a mistake I often see is people over explaining their objectives in finding participants. We're a Series B funded startup, Y Combinator, with a pre-launch target of Q4, and we are looking to onboard that. No one cares. Hi, I'm doing some market research to try to learn about YouTubers who are seeking collaborators. Is this something you'd be able to talk to me about or make a connection for someone else? That's not exactly right, but just think about the contrast in the kind of language. Talk to people like a real person in their language. You don't need to justify your business, your business, because then you're sort of making it salesy and pitchy, and you want to make it person to person-y. I think of those two maybe as a combination can maybe help you get a little further. And again, I don't know what you are actually doing, so in no way is this a critique of what's happening, but some tips for you going forward.
Thank you. Sorry, all of my emojis just came up at the same time. It's everything everyone has posted so far. Still under construction.
That's awesome.
We have the fun here. We have the funds. And thank you to Darren and other person whose name I missed for becoming members here. Thank you for your support. And of course, thanks to Steve for these great answers. This is Office Hours Ask Us Anything, and so you are welcome to send stuff in. I am watching for the emails to come in, but I am not seeing anybody else asking questions. So I think maybe you just all have to stop drooling and staring at the screen and ask your question. Oh, Denise has a question. Good. We've got Denise's question, and let's get that on the screen. Friend of the show, Denise. Let's get that on the screen. Sorry, I've got all the things here, and everyone's going, yeah, great question
here. Denise, yeah. Better be good.
Denise is lovely. She's here a lot. Denise says, what do you think about doing research with the same users repetitively?
Yes, that is, sometimes we call that longitudinal research. Like, there's a fancy name for that. That might be good if things are changing. So I'm going to talk to somebody, every month. And so what might be changing? Something might be changing for them. So they've got some new thing in their lives, and a new process or new circumstance, and how are they adapting or integrating kind of quarterly, and you can see the trajectory. Sometimes you do research and you only get somebody when something is new and you don't really understand what does that settle into. So you can sort of watch them proceed through a relationship with a product or service or a brand or in a circumstance in their lives. So you can do that over time. So that's kind of an example of longitudinal research, but also what you're doing might change. We're going to meet with you in April and learn from you about, how you're going through a certain task. We're going to go back and work for the next couple of months on some design concepts and wireframes. We're going to build some prototypes that we want your feedback on. We're going to come back out and say, hey, we talked to you before about this. Here's the direction we're going in. It's just a wireframe. What do you think? So they can give you feedback on that. And then, your design and development process proceeds further, and you show them the next iteration, or you show them a pre-launch. And that's fantastic. I think that's a very valid method. So you're not, I think asking the same people the same questions over and over again without anything change is not valuable. But if things change, sometimes we call that a panel, right? There's sort of a longitudinal, there's sort of lots of terms to describe setting up those relationships. I think it can be really rewarding for both parties because you build up such a rapport over time with them. I trailed off there, but that was the end.
Okay, I thought there was something else coming.
No, I don't know. I
And
ran out.
land. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. And the only thing that I would add is I've spoken to some people who have company policies about how often they can contact someone when it's not a longitudinal study. So just make sure that when you are planning your research, you've decided that we're going to try to meet with the same people over a period of time, and make sure the people know that. Otherwise, I know some companies will actually keep in their database, ooh, we used that person in September for some research, let's give them a break and maybe not bug them for 6 months, 9 months, whatever it is. So just make sure you have some sort of policy that you follow, and then get everybody on board for it. So we've got a question from Chang, and then we've got some more questions popping up that I'll get on the list. And Chang says, Steve, could you share some tips to help the engineering team and the product manager see the value of user research?
I think that is an acknowledgement of the universality of this question.
Yes, for sure.
So saying everyone feels your pain here. I think you've quite concisely encapsulated just the existential challenge of user researchers or people who do research. So some tips. And again, these are the best version of these will be so localized to you, the power dynamics, the relationships, who are the advocates. But so some things that may or may not apply to you in your organization. Talking to people about outcomes, not process, I think is helpful. And I think you kind of put this in your question, the value of user research, which doesn't say, it's different than how do we get people to let us do user research. So I really like the way you're asking it. So you can talk to people about things like, what data do you have? What assumptions do you have? So companies sort of thrive culturally on assumptions, right? Our users who are our, gold tier users are more likely to convert to this and this and then become a lifetime value, this and this. Those things are assumptions. Sometimes they're aspirations. Sometimes they're hypotheses. So I think having a judgmental on your part that's just sort of sorting information out. What do you know? What do you assume or hope or aspire? And you may have to kind of go back and forth and say, well, is that something we know? Do we have data about that? Or is that something we are, making a stake on, that we assume and we're building towards that? That doesn't make it bad. You're just trying to differentiate that. What are the risks? Where are the risks if we're wrong? And wrong, of course, is such a binary thing. Usually the truth is sort of a delta from, hey, delta, woo, is a delta from like where you start. Yes.
Secret word.
Yes. So I think, trying to have those conversations with people, not about here's what I should do research, but more about, where are you today with what you assume is true, what you hope is true, what you know. And I think people will tell you what they know. And then I think you can be critical of that. Like, I think this is the classic qualitative versus quantitative data. And this is a gross oversimplification, but sometimes we have quant data that tells us what, but we don't have qual data that tells us why. And so, so someone says, hey, the engineers are making decisions based on this data we have, which we think means that this is the intention, this is the goal, this is the aspiration, this is the belief they have about what our value proposition is. You're trying to uncover all those questions. We're not doing any research now except internal research. We're just trying to get to, how are people making decisions? What decisions are they making? What are the risks? What are the sources of information? What are the gaps? What's the risk if we don't address those gaps? And so based on that, can we all agree on what are some mitigations? What are some ways to go about this? Because I think, if we wait for people to come to us with user research requests, they're not necessarily going to be the right ones for the organization. Hey, we're going to ship this. Can you validate that it's usable? Well, it's too late, and now we also don't understand if we're solving a problem that people actually think is important to them. So having these conversations, and we're not even saying what we want to do about it. It's not, let's talk about how to get us to do user research. It's let's talk about how we're making decisions, what we're assuming, what we know about the world, what our risks are. And you're facilitating that, right? You are, and Chang, I'm saying you asked the question, so now you're responsible for this. But there's some interesting user research skills in facilitating, creating some alignment, and then, seeing what the appetite is or the commitment is for things. And then I guess the last piece I'll say is, sort of two related pieces. What are small things that you can do? So understanding what the objections is, or the sense of risk. Oh, this is too slow. We don't know if we're going to be able to act on it. You can unpack what some of those risks of the solutions exploring are, the ways to respond to these gaps are. And then are there small things that you can do, and small things that will get other people to tell stories about it. And I think a lot of organizations go from no appetite for user research to more appetite than we can possibly address, and almost just sometimes magically tips from one to the other. So doing a small piece of research that's tied to a gap that you've identified, that highlights or guides a decision to be made, including like a decision not to do something. It doesn't have to be whatever. It impacts their choice of their next steps, their actions. Becomes a kind of an internal organizational story that people can talk about. Once they start talking about it, now it's not you kind of advocating, now they're advocating. They're speaking the language of their fellow skeptics or fellow PMs, fellow engineers. And they start saying like, hey, I want one of those things. Chang, can you do for us what you did for this other team? That I think is sort of the slow and steady, but very deliberate, very intentional, facilitating alignment to get to where you can make a difference.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Everyone's writing. I'm taking notes. So that was a beautiful answer. And I will just break for a moment and remind everybody, please do subscribe on the YouTube channel. And as we've seen twice today, we do also have paid memberships for just $3 a month. You will unlock cool emoji and help support the channel. YouTube keeps a third of that. So I appreciate anything anybody gives because I have all the ads turned off. And of course, we have a higher level where I'll do some streams just for you guys and gals and other. What else did I want to tell you? Our Slack channel, I don't know where to point because I moved my seat. Our Slack channel has almost 600 people there, though I'd say 30 to 50 of you are quite active. So it's free to join. There's no membership. So come on down and have some pie. Let's see. We do have 6 questions queued up. So, and I see Julianne's and some other people. So let me start putting these up on the board. Ariane says, hello. How do you think someone can learn to ask and improvise the best possible questions?
Great question, Ariane. I like that this is about learning. It's a good way to frame it, because this is it's a practice, reflect, practice. And one thing to keep in mind is that the best questions are follow-up questions. I think one reason that people put pressure on themselves in doing user research, especially maybe if they're newer, is that they got to get everything into the right question and let it be sort of not too leading, but directing them. And that's a lot of pressure. But really, you can ask a question and ask kind of the simplest, what I'm not modeling very well today, the simplest, shortest, fewest words question, and then let that person kind of go, and then ask a follow-up question, and ask another follow-up question, and ask another follow-up question. So what you're actually doing is asking multiple questions. You're having a conversation, or you're interviewing. So taking that pressure off yourself and kind of breaking it down into multiple questions, I think is a much more effective way. In terms of an approach to learn. So there's doing it, but also building in some reflection. So if you're doing interviews, if you're recording them and you're getting them transcribed, which I hope you're doing both those things, review those. And then Debbie, you posted some sample interview sessions, I think. Is that right? With Joel Barr?
Yeah, we've been doing, as part of my micro lessons series, we've been doing some observational research, fake observational research here. And in fact, we've got 2 more coming. So we're going to do a total of 8. And that way we've got some fake real data to practice distilling.
So even without doing the distilling, people can watch those interviews, and they're fake, but that's fine. I think you're just looking for examples here of what this looks like. Listening to, podcasts, a lot of interview-based podcasts. Debbie, I know you do interviews. I do interviews, but just, Terry Gross on Fresh Air, Mark Maron on WTF. It's not about these people are all perfect and all the questions they ask are perfect. It's about the engagement you have with the process of what you see in these interviews. Krista Tippett does On Being, I think is the name of her podcast. These are all really, really different. So just dip into some things that are interesting to you and spend some time paying attention to how those interviewers are interviewing. And if you want to get super meta, there's a podcast called The Turnaround, which is is a series of interviews with interviewers about interviewing. So journalists, it comes from the world of journalism. So people like Ira Glass, Audie Cornish from National Public Radio, Larry King is in there. They're super interesting. They're not doing what we are doing, but you can hear the application of the technique, that they are making explicit choices in order to get to their kinds of outcomes. And so we wouldn't do exactly what they would do, but we can see sort of the power that they have to exercise in asking questions. And so we can reflect like, oh, well, I wouldn't do that, but what I am doing is this for these reasons. So then, again, look at your own data, look at other people's data, look at fake, I'm calling these all data, fake interviews, podcast interviews. They're all data for you to go back into and reflect on. I think that is, you can never stop learning about interviewing by watching people interview and ask questions.
Super great advice on people getting more practice. We've got 8 questions in the queue, including everything from YouTube and the 2 that came in through the anonymous link. So I promise I've got them all on the list. The next one was actually a follow-up to Denise's old question. Friend of the show, Naz, who will be cooking for us on Friday, says, separate from longitudinal, don't participant pools create use of participants repeatedly for different studies? Quick note, tomorrow our guest will be talking about making your own pool. And Steve, over to you.
Not sure I get this question.
I think, Naz is a little new to a UX, not psychology. I think she has a bachelor's in psychology, but certainly now learning UX and UX research. So, Naz, can you give us a follow-up on that? Did you... because, you can have a pool and you can use participants repeatedly or not. Correct me on that, Steve?
Right. It goes back to what you were saying about, you had a really good point, Debbie, about not oversampling within any group, whether it's your customer base or specific pools. And you were sort of warning, Debbie, against we have waste, but different people are pulling from it. And so I think the worst case is, hey, customer gets a request to be in a study, and then weeks later they get a request from a different team to be in a study. And that's sort of misalignment. I think that's sort of the risk of oversampling the base. But I'm not sure sort of how the label pools. I'm not sure we've answered the question. But
that's
maybe
okay.
We'll get a
Naz, if we haven't covered it somewhere in here, let us know, because I see you in the chat room. Someone who you just might know, a Darren Hood, said, can you give us some high-level tips for UX research strategy, like making decisions on the type of research to engage in?
So this phrase, UX research strategy, has sort of come up recently. Chris Gison, and I'm sure even though I've heard his name pronounced out loud, now I feel like I'm messing it up when I say it. Geison, I think is what it is, although I'd have to look at it. I'm saying a name without looking at it. At Workday, he just ran a panel and then gave a talk at the Advancing Research Conference about research strategy. And I want to find the link to a page he put up, because he's interested in getting a conversation together about this, because I think one of his theses is how come we don't talk about strategy when we talk about research, but we talk about it consistently with every other sort of adjacent field. So maybe Debbie, I'll find that link in a minute, because he's got a placeholder page. Anyway, so this conversation is emergent and growing, and I would love to hook you up to that conversation, because I'm interested in it. Making decisions in the type of research to engage in. I think in some ways this is parallel to what we were talking to Chang about in terms of getting engagement and doing research. Thinking about what broadly, what are the organization's needs? I've heard one of the people who was on my podcast talked about how there's a very OKR, objective and key responsibility is what OKR stand for, right? Debbie, you're nodding.
Objective and key results.
Key results. See, I said it wrong. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm there for you.
So it's like an organizational planning tool. So each team sets up its OKRs, and then the research team, the research lead, goes in and looks at what those OKRs are, and then proposes a stream of research ahead of time that says, hey, we're going to do all these things as a business. Here's the research that I recommend that we engage in to support you. So that means you're not doing reactive research. Team A has this question, Team B has this question. You have an overview of all of what's happening, and then you can propose research where one study is going to address multiple things. You can see gaps in what the company's plan is and say, hey, we want to do some strategic research to understand this customer base that we want to move into. So if you are planning if a strategic mindset, and that's one person or a team of people that have that responsibility. And the way I think this was Udemy was the company, and they were talking about how they would build a plan and then use that to kind of go and propose resource and they get a buy-in from leadership, product leadership and design leadership and everyone that kind of controlled resources. Here's the research we're going to be doing next quarter, next 2 quarters, based on the other things the company is doing. So it's almost like road mapping, kind of planning. So yeah, I don't know. That's I'll stop there. And Debbie, I don't know what you can add to this. Anything would be great.
I don't think I need to add anything to that. I am looking at the questions still in the list. So next, we have a question that says, what's the best way to get team members away from building hypotheses based on business problems instead of actual user problems? I'll try to put that up on the screen.
So we want teams not to make hypotheses on
Here we go. What's the best way to get team members away from building hypotheses based on business problems instead of actual user problems?
It sounds like this is, because I think there's a relationship between all of these. And I'm not sure if we're talking about before we do research or after we do research. Because I
Probably
think,
before, but it doesn't say.
Yeah. So before we don't know it. So I think about it this way, and maybe we have just some terminology that's not 100% lined up here. I apologize for that. I think about the business problem as, what do we need to do as a company? We need to, drive growth here. We need to change this feature. We need to update, a new platform, whatever. There's something about us as the producer. But part of planning research is to take that question, if that's where we're starting, and then ask, well, what do we need to know about people in order to be able to respond to the business problem? So, right, we have data that says that we have a lot of churn. So our research question might be, what value do people find, or what's the trajectory of their use experience from sort of onboarding through leaving? Like we start to ask questions about people that would give us insight about questions we have or decisions we have about ourselves. And so I think what I find is that people come with all sorts of things. They come with, here's the research question we have. We want to learn this. And usually I have to say to them, well, what is it? Why do you have that question? Why is that important to your business? What is it that you're going to do? How are you going to act on that? So that the business question and the research question are kind of aligned. So it can go in either direction. And then, of course, there's the research method we're going to use. Sometimes people will say, here's the method we want to do, Steve. And then I have to say, well, what is it you're trying to learn? And why is learning that important? So I think taking whatever people give you is great to start. And then, that facilitation and planning is about asking questions kind of up and down that chain so you can kind of create a research plan. Here's where we're at as a company. Here's what we're going to learn. And here's how we're going to go about learning that. And that's research that then supports what the organization is challenged with right now.
Thank you. I'm going to put the next one up. If you don't mind, the hits keep coming. All right. So Wilson is back and he says, got any tips on how to conduct interviews with children or teenagers who might be in grades 1 through 10? It's such a huge group, so I'm assuming I would have to customize my questions for each age group. And I want to add to that, do we need parent permission? Do we need the parents to be present?
Right. So I think there's some ethical aspects to that and there's some legal aspects to that.
Yes.
And I suspect that varies from place to place. There's not only, the interaction that we have with people who are minors, but also their data. I think I'm going to guess there's some data privacy aspects that might vary by age and vary by geography. I don't know what those are. And in fact, I have not done a lot of work with young people. But even the range that you're talking about, I think this is kind of what you're getting at, right? These are really different groups. I guess I wouldn't think about coming up with different questions for each. I think high level, what is it you're trying to learn? Like, what are you doing? How do you do it? What are the steps? Why do you do it this way? What could be different? Like that could be every interview about anything, right? But your technique for talking to someone of a certain age, and even in those ages, you're going to get very different kind of, emotional maturity and different kinds of people that are more or less articulate just because of their age. So you're going to get a range. So I think you want to have some things in your pocket. Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. Like, what are sort of some resources for interviewing kids? I don't know. Debbie, have you seen anything on that? I'm just punting back to you.
Yeah, you're welcome to punt back to me. I have to admit, I don't know that. I normally don't deal in that. Kelene posted to the chat that usability.gov has some templates that ask parents of minors for a signature, and that was it. And it sounds like she didn't see anything else on usability.gov that might have said what to do in these cases. I'm not sure. This sounds like we have to bring in the lawyers and see what's right to do. I would imagine if we record those interviews, we give the parents a copy of the recording or something just so they know nothing strange happened during this. But those are some of my thoughts, and I think we just have to go with lawyers on this one. I think this might be out of our league. Steve?
I'm going to suggest looking at Deborah Gelman's book, Design for Kids, Digital Products and Learning. It's a book about doing design, and it's probably behind me somewhere, but I don't think I can look through an index while we're talking. But I would check that book out and see what it is that Deborah has got to say about the process of doing research. even though it's a design book. That's maybe where I would start. And then I found the thing we were talking about a minute ago. Here's the great URL, researchstrategy.info. This is, it's really like a holding page right now, but that has subscribed to a mailing list. If you're interested in an emergent discussion on user research strategy, this is what Chris is kind of building right now.
Great, thank you. We had a question from Kelene from earlier. It was a comment she made to Chang, but it kind of turned into a question. And it was, a previous guest of the podcast said she conducts confidential individual interviews with company employees. I feel as though that could be really valuable. I wonder if Steve's done it. Steve, do you do, or how do you do that kind of stakeholder or employee interviews?
So sometimes the project itself is internal. So I think let's just kind of break this down. So we might talk to stakeholders and then customers, users, consumers, people outside the organization. We might also stakeholders and then users who are employees. They're part of the organization. Like I worked with an HR group, so the customers were internal recruiters. So the user research that you're doing is with internal people. And I love the word confidential in here because it's a really interesting one where I think you got to be careful with the ethical aspects here. I don't have an easy answer. It's a good thing to sort out ahead of time with your client, your project team. To set expectations. If these are going to be confidential, what is that going to look like? What's going to happen to the recordings? Are you going to report back quotes? Because I think stuff that we anonymize gets de-anonymized so easily, right? You can say in even a mid to large size company, you can say one user did how the this and this didn't work this and this away, and
everyone
you're like
knows who it is.
That. Like, oh yeah. Ted, right? And maybe not even rolling their eyes, but you've de-anonymized that person because the stories are all there. So, just figuring out what that is. And then I think setting expectations with the people you interview. So, and we talked about lawyers a second ago. If you're an employee of a company, that company has policies and that are either HR or legal sets. The obligation of privacy to an employee who's covered by an employment agreement is different and perhaps less than say if you're talking to a consumer, someone who doesn't have a relationship with that company. If you're talking to B2B in B2B contexts, they may, as a purchaser of your product, they may have a privacy agreement. So there are things in place that set this up, but we're sort of talking about the privacy aspect of it. But I'll just say that, yeah, for sure, these interviews are super important. And I'm going to use the word delta again, if I can get some confetti. A lot of what we're doing in research is starting with what does the product team believe, and what's the delta between that and what the customers or user base kind of believe or expect. So there's no sort of absolute truth. Our customers want this. Our customers don't understand this. We started with an assumption. We talked before about assumptions and aspirations and hypotheses. We are talking this way, but the difference is that our customers are behaving this way, or our customers think this. So just an example, I worked on a design system for a company that has a big company with a big design system, and I spent a lot of time with the people building and running and advocating that design system, and they described how it works and sort of how they've created this design system and who's using it and how and what sort of the checks and balances are and sort of what their goals are, what their blockers are. And then I talked to people that were using the design system about how they were designing. One thing that emerged in this was I found out in this company there are at least 9 forks of the design system that are being used by different teams. And I was shocked. Like, do you guys know that this system, which you're treating kind of like a monolith, is being like readapted for these reasons? Like, that's a huge challenge to you. Only to find out that this team says like, oh yeah, we know about that. And, I was shocked. Like, well, why didn't you tell me? Well, they didn't tell me because they were describing their ideal world. So this back and forth between what the team described and what the users experienced and how they kind of depicted the world, that gap was super, super important. So, at first I came back with, did you know this thing was happening? Oh yeah. So when we came back kind of with the final workshop, it was, this is happening and you're kind of denying it and pretending that it doesn't exist. Like, here's where the gaps are and what the opportunity is. So those stakeholder interviews were super important to kind of ground me in, in this case, some dysfunction or some denial about the world. And you can't be as stimulated by what you see with the users if you haven't sort of started off with that. Well, what is the default view? What is the kind of assumptive model we have about what things look like out there?
Okay, thank you. I'm actually going to close new questions for now. If you haven't asked a question, you are too late. Please remember that every Tuesday I do office hours Ask Me Anything at 6:30 p.m. Italy time. Next week it'll be at a different time for you if you're in North America because we're changing clocks this weekend. And then I'm also doing a 10 a.m. Italy time one on Tuesday as well to see if I can capture time zones east of me. So we're going to close questions for now, but I've got a few more in the queue ready for action. So Julianne says, if you've done user research for a company as a student and then reached out to the company and want to provide your insights, do you have any advice if they aren't familiar with UX?
So this is research done, I think, as a student project. The company wasn't really involved in it. Yes. They don't have to know about UX. They don't have to know about user research or ethnography or usability. Everyone knows the phrase research. You can always call it market research. And I wouldn't be interested in quibbling about what's the difference between I don't care what the boundaries are around those terms. So to find someone and say, hey, we, as part of a student project, we did some market research to talk to people about X, and would love to share this with you. That I think is fine. The challenge is to find the right person who cares about this. And I've known agencies that have done this. They've done speculative research projects and then prepared a report and then gone on LinkedIn and tried to find people who they think are going to take a meeting with them, not to pitch their services, but to sort of indirectly pitch their services by sharing this. So you're going to learn a lot. LinkedIn is where I would start, but you're going to learn a lot about what titles people have, what kind of receptiveness you get to that. Maybe you put up a teaser webpage that, sort of legitimizes this, like a trailer or a couple of slides. Maybe there's a sign up thing that says, hey, for more information, give me your email address. I think you should definitely try to do this as a presentation, not send somebody a deck. Try to have a conversation with them and take their questions. But that part, so anyway, this sounds like a very cool initiative for you, and you're going to learn a lot about where the friction points are, but go for that. That sounds great.
All right, thanks. Moving on, because we only have about 20 minutes left with our gratitude to Steve. How to present user research findings to non-designers other than a long report?
I think the first episode of my podcast was with Greg Bernstein, who is now at Webflow, but he was at Mail. He was the head of research at MailChimp at the time. And he talked about a practice that MailChimp had. I don't know if it's still active, but their practice was every bit of research that they do gets turned into three, let's just call them outputs. There were three different outputs. And I think it was something like this. It was 10 bullets in an email. It was a report, so like a deck, and it was the archive of all the information spreadsheets and recordings. And so everything was available at sort of those 3 levels of what do you call those, fidelity or depth. And they would circulate those in different ways. So those emails would be posted. This was long enough ago. I think it was pre-Slack, but you can imagine there's a Slack channel in your work group that says like, hey, research highlights. And every time someone does a study, you write up like a quick thing, bloop, right? Here's some things that we're learning. Everything has a link to say, hey, here's who owns the study, who did it, reach out for more. If you do something and there's a report, you host a lunch and learn, or, a Friday happy hour where you kind of talk through things. And then you can always point people to kind of self-service into kind of the repository for more information. So, I mean, that's sort of still adjacent to the questions, like how do we speak about these things to non-designers? I mean, I think that's exactly what you should be doing. Like we keep talking about, well, what are the objectives we're trying to address in the research? So are those design objectives, business objectives, getting to know the customer better? What is it that we want people to know? And I think, the kinds of reports you do should cover that kind of information. You want to, tell real stories about real people. Sometimes we're anonymizing people. Sometimes we're showing pictures or blurred out pictures. This is all sort of your own data privacy things to work out. But we want to make stories about people come alive. We pull quotes. We tell stories. We explain the models and frameworks and the things that we've interpreted and concluded based on what the research has revealed. Maybe we're not talking about what design changes we should make. Maybe we're just talking about here's the opportunity, here's the unmet need, here's how people think of us. So you have lots and lots of things that you can report. And I think, yes, be mindful of who your audience is and what's relevant to them. You still might want to tell them some things that they don't know that they want to know, that you think they need to know. I think you can push beyond just where they're at. But that's the part, I think, of crafting a story for your audience, or your audience says. This could be multiple share outs, multiple reports that highlight different chapters of your document based on your audience. So yeah, I think you're on the right track.
Thanks for that. I'm going to add something briefly before our next question, and that is very often I'm still a PowerPoint chick. So, I'm doing the 50 to 80 page report, and then I'm doing the 16 PowerPoint slide version. I've also been doing some video clip montages so that people can just see it, and I do them by theme. So I might say, here's a bunch of things people said about our crappy portal or whatever. But mostly what I tend to recommend when we get this question, because we do get it a lot, is ask those people. Ask those people how they tend to prefer information. You get some people who are more abstract, some more concrete, some like videos, some like quotes. You can't write 8 million reports, but I would say talk to your teammates and see how they prefer to get some of this information. Remember that possibly early in the research, you might have asked them if there was something they were hoping to learn from it, so you will need to make sure you circle back with them and deliver those findings, insights, and suggestions. So that's what I want to add to that. The next question, I can see why it was asked anonymously, because it mentions something that everybody who watches me knows I am not for. So we're going to learn Steve's perspective on this stuff. This question came in anonymously. Let me get it on the screen since it's a little bit on the long side. And I have just copied and pasted the wrong thing. Give me a moment. Hold on. Copy. There we go. I think this will come up. Let's press the magic number. Yeah, there we go. So this question says, what's the best way to make sure your research actually lands with the team rather than just being read once and disappearing into a void? Do you recommend taking the findings straight into something like a design sprint? Can we hear what the fire thing is? I'll go first, but I want to hear design sprints.
Okay. So
You're allowed to be for them. I'm against them.
I'm going to take the design sprint phrase here in the best possible interpretation of that. So, and I think this is such a great follow on to where we were with like, what's the form that you kind of document and share in? And the thing that I would have said if I had kept going in that was that, and you're kind of getting at this, Debbie, is that we're sort of talking about the artifact, but there's also the experience with the artifact. So yeah, I talked about a lunch and learn. You talked about, Debbie, like circling back with people. I think that's the thing to build in. And so the best way for me to make the research actually land is to have a workshop that's part of the delivery. And I'm kind of controlling about this. I like to have a, what do we call it? A share out, a readout, a session that is mostly, here's what's in the document. Like here's kind of all the findings together, it written in a way that speaks to you, but we're going to spend time and go through this. We're going to ask questions. We're going to discuss. We're going to get clarifications. We're not going to make any decisions. We're not going to take action. We're just kind of going to absorb, because often it's a lot, and we are, like the example with the design language piece, the design system, we're challenging the way you thought the world was. And so that takes a little bit of time to process. So what I would like people to do is like go home or log off, I guess, in this world, and come back another day, like tomorrow, and then let's have another meeting with a different approach to that meeting, where we talk about, and I mean, I say talk, I mean, it's a heavily facilitated session where we take some of the key pieces from the research, and lots of ways you can pick those. You can tell them what the most important ones are, or they can kind of select. But you start talking about how are we going to act on these findings. Now it's a participatory session. It's collaborative. We are doing divergent thinking. We are asking how might we. We're using our Miro or our Mural or a Jamboard or voting in Slack. I don't care. People are playing very creatively with how to use these tools to kind of facilitate group decisions, different kinds of thinking. We can get people to draw, sketch, take pictures of sticky notes in their room, whatever that is. Or that is a very different kind of activity, a different mindset. I don't want to do that when I am trying to help people understand the nuance between like why these 9 forked, design pattern systems are an issue. We got to work together and talk, and then work together and create. So when I see design sprint, I'm like, oh, we're doing some kind of creative activity over time. But I mean, I think the design sprint framing, if you put capital letters on that, is like, yeah, Debbie can say no to that in a much more articulate way than I would. But anyway, share the report. Then you own the facilitation of an activity where people diverge, but also converge. And at the end of that activity, you ask them to write down what the next steps are. And so the corollary here is, remember before we talked about what's the business problem and what's the research question. So if this is a if the business question is like, oh, we're not going to do anything different, we just want to make sure we're on the right track, like don't do that research, right? Here's how you prevent people from not paying attention to your research, is to do research where they're not committed to taking action. So when you're planning the research, understand what they want to learn, why they want to learn it, what they're going to do about it, and kind of what their timing is and other constraints. So they're committing ahead of time to acting on the research. You're setting up the program with that information in mind. So that is it's like a social contract that you can come back to and say, we're going to have a workshop. Tell me what your next steps are. And you may need to go back to that group in 30 days and do a 30-day check-in or a 60-day check-in. But you're taking on more sort of facilitation work with the research. But that reframes it all from, I wrote a report and no one read it, right? Now you've expanded your role. And I think it's a really important shift in the power that you have to impact and influence. But you've got to put the work in to do that.
I will add to that, even though we're running out of time. If you are new here, this will be new to you. If you're not new here, the chat room has already predicted a number of things I'm going to say. So I just want to quickly add that while I loved many of the things Steve just said, I personally happen to be against design sprints, pretty much any definition of them, and I am mostly against workshops. I believe that especially if we have the power, ability, autonomy, budget, time, headcount to do good research, to take it now into having everyone sketch and everyone be a designer and dot voting and some of these other things is like the design version of what we don't want for research. And so someone's put up sweating. Thank you. So while I know there are many people who are for workshops and for these things, I happen to be against them. And I just want to see people stick to user-centered design and things that will promote our autonomy and our ability to make decisions in our own domain, because other domains do not invite us to workshops. We don't get to dot vote on the product roadmap. I don't get to deploy the Kubernetes cluster. I don't get to sketch the back-end database architecture. So those who have been here before have heard me say these things. Those who are new, welcome to the Delta CX channel. Won't you please subscribe? But I would say, while I agreed 98% with Steve, I would just say that I have a little bit of a different style in that I am 98% against workshops. I think a team meeting, I will hold a meeting and I will deliver these things. But as soon as people get to play junior designer, electrician, outlet patrol, I think we're getting into territory where we don't even realize how disrespected we are. And I should shut up because we've got only 5 minutes left with Steve, and he's so wonderful to give us his time today. We've got a few more questions. I hope we'll have time for them. But just in case, Steve, tell everybody how they can find you and follow you and stalk you and be part of your world.
Right. If you can spell my last name, you can find me. I'm on Portugal.com is my site. It's got links there to the kind of consulting that I do. My books, my podcasts, you can find those there. LinkedIn, I love connecting with people on LinkedIn. So Steve Portigal. All right, I'm letting all this go. Pointless workshops. I'm going to brand Pointless Workshops.
Pointlessworkshops.com. You could make certificates in that. You could sell that.
It's .horse. I've just bought pointlessworkshops.horse. LinkedIn is a great place to connect with me. I share things about research and stuff to make us think about the work that we're doing kind of in an intentional way. So that's it.
Yeah, find this guy, follow him, buy his books, do all the things, everybody, and let's try to get in a couple of more questions. And Peaches, I'm so happy to see you here. Peaches is a friend of the show. She is in the UK, and she is an experienced UX researcher, but she goes by Peaches, so I'm calling her that. So let's see. Okay, I've got a question here, and it says, and we may have already covered this, so I may have to ask you for the lightning version because we're down to our last few minutes. What do you suggest in order to get stakeholder buy-in for generative research?
Yeah, we did cover it. I think it's talking to them about what are your pains, right? What are you struggling with? What are you worried about? What risks do you see? What do you know? What do you want to know? The buy-in is the generative research is your response to understanding of the problem. So work on the problem, understanding the problem, and propose whatever you think is needed in that context.
Super. Thanks for the lightning version. Also, we have the question also from Dimitris, friend of the show. What does that say? How do you handle situations where there are just a few users, like B2B tools? What would you do differently?
Right, we've talked about pools and longitudinal research and repeat. I think, right, you're going to be in this situation. So, setting this up as an ongoing relationship. So we talked about longitudinal studies where like something was changing. Here, I think we want to set up a relationship with you. We're going to be talking about different things over, this period of time. So, hey, today we're here to ask you about this. Hey, today we're here to ask you about this. We remember you told us this other thing. We're kind of over here now. So you're framing the whole thing as not longitudinal, but kind of ongoing. Thinking about how do you reward them for that relationship? What can you share with them besides traditional incentives? So can you take on support of, say, a charity that the organization believes in, and be kind of have that be an ongoing sort of sustaining thing that you're doing? Can you send out a fun newsletter? Can you kind of send them swag? So I think research is often kind of transactional. We did this study, here's this thing. But if you want to have a relationship with somebody, maybe every month you, have a box of donuts sent to their home office, and that you decouple the request to participate in research from the kind of ongoing reminder of the fact that you value the relationship with them. So shifting the dynamics, I think, to secure their kind of longitudinal participation, even though there's separate sort of one-off studies that you might be doing with them.
Thanks. And we made it to the last question, and it is, any advice for striking the right balance between undertaking strategic research to help inform broader product decisions and also being there for the team to execute tactical research as a solo researcher for a team?
The key to striking the right balance is to shift from proactive research to reactive research. So I gave the example from Udemy, and it's actually the podcast with Leif Ulaby, who describes the OKRs. I think you can just look at the roadmap and talk about what you want to do. So building some sort of plan for your availability that is committed ahead of time based on your gathering of context of what they're going to be doing. And maybe you leave some percentage of your time open for kind of reactive things. So you want to, figure out what is the right balance for you personally, for the company and its maturity. That could be 80-20, 90-10, 50-50. You've got to kind of make a case ahead of time for what you're going to be doing. And so in that OKR example, right, they went to leadership and said, here's what we heard, here's what we're going to be doing. So same thing for you. Here's all the research. You should have a longer list of potential research than you can possibly do, so you can advocate for headcount, working with contractors, working with consultants and vendors, to kind of show them that the appetite is, the organization's need is large, not your need. Their need is large. Here's how you prioritize. Here's what your kind of mix, your palette looks like, and get them to agree to that. So again, proactive versus reactive is how you control what that balance is.
Super, super love it. Thank you so much. And with that, we are pretty much out of time. So Steve, any final words for today's broadcast?
Thank you, everyone, for the questions. And thanks, Debbie, for having me. I'm going to wave because we get to wave on video now. And it's not dorky. I like to. I don't know who are waving shaming. So I'm just starting the waving now. Thanks very much. It was great questions. It's too much work. I look forward to staying in touch with people. And thanks so much, Debbie.
Yeah, and everyone's saying thank you in the chat room. Thanks again. Remember, find Steve, buy the books, connect with him, stalk him appropriately and platonically. And I'm going to play us out of here. But Steve, I sure hope we can have you back in the future and, let us know. Oh, we're getting applause from the chat group. Thanks again, everybody. And see you tomorrow for how to create your own user pool. I hope you'll join for that. Thanks. Bye.
Delta CX, available for CX and UX consulting, projects, and training. Contact us for a free consultation.